In 1939, Harry S. Truman wrote, "Freemasonry is a system of morals which makes it easier to live with your fellow man whether he understands it or not." Few men were as devoted to the teachings of our fraternity as President Truman. He believed in following the core tenets of brotherly love, relief, and truth as a way of bettering the world and himself. As long and storied as his career in government was, so was his journey in Freemasonry. To this day, Masons look upon his many accomplishments as an example of how to conduct oneself with integrity. Let's hear about Harry S. Truman, shall we? Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri in 1884. He grew up in Independence, and for 12 years prospered as a Missouri farmer. He went to France during World War I as a captain in the field artillery. Returning, he married Elizabeth Virginia Wallace and opened a haberdashery in Kansas City. For those that didn't know, a haberdashery and a men's clothing store. Thank goodness for Google. From 1922 to 1924, Truman was a judge of the Jackson County court system. From 1926 to 1934, he was the presiding judge. He became a senator in 1934. During World War II, he headed the Senate War Investigating Committee, checking into waste and corruption and saving perhaps as much as $15 billion. That could buy a lot of clothes at the haberdashery. In 1944, he was elected as Vice President of the United States, taking office on January 20th, 1945. Just 4 months later, he succeeded Roosevelt following his death to become president. In 1949, he was elected as president. As president, Truman made some of the most crucial decisions in history. Soon after VE Day, the war against Japan had reached its final stage. An urgent plea to Japan to surrender was rejected. Truman, after consultations with his advisors, ordered atomic bombs dropped on cities devoted to war work. 2 were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese surrender quickly followed. In June 1945, Truman witnessed the signing of the Charter of the United Nations, hopefully established to preserve peace. Thus far, he had followed his predecessor's policies, but he soon developed his own. He presented to Congress a 21-point program, proposing the expansion of Social Security, a full employment program, a permanent Fair Employment Practices Act, and public housing and slum clearance. The program, Truman wrote, symbolizes for me my assumption of the office of president in my own right. It became known as the Fair Deal. Dangers and crises marked the foreign scene as Truman campaigned successfully in 1948. In foreign affairs, he was already providing his most effective leadership. In 1947, as the Soviet Union pressured Turkey and, through guerrillas, threatened to take over Greece, he asked Congress to aid the two countries, enunciating the program that bears his name, the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan, named for his Secretary of State, stimulated spectacular economic recovery in war-torn Western Europe. When the Russians blockaded the western sectors of Berlin in 1948, Truman created a massive airlift to supply Berliners until the Russians backed down. Meanwhile, he was negotiating a military alliance to protect Western nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949. In June 1950, when the communist government of North Korea attacked South Korea, Truman conferred promptly with his military advisors. There was, he wrote, complete, almost unspoken acceptance on the part of everyone that whatever had to be done to meet this aggression had to be done. There was no suggestion from anyone that either the United Nations or the United States could back away from it. The Korean War began when the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. Adhering to its policy of containment, the United States could not ignore the threat of communism in Asia, but neither the president nor the public wanted a long, drawn-out war. President Truman hand-selected General Douglas MacArthur to lead the U.S. troops in South Korea. MacArthur arrived at his post a World War II hero, having successfully led multiple troops through the war. Following his victories in World War II, he had become the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. MacArthur was revered and highly praised in the United States. Stay tuned for a future episode on how the relationship between MacArthur and Truman changed. Yikes, a pretty nasty tale when MacArthur decided to ignore direct orders from his commander-in-chief. That wasn't the only controversy he was linked to. According to his own library, Harry Truman was known to have the prejudices of his community when it came to views of race. He used racial slurs, told racist jokes, opposed sit-ins and intermarriage, and called Dr. Martin Luther King a troublemaker. Whether he would act as president as he felt in private was not the question. It was assumed he would follow the lead of most other politicians of that time period and not show sympathy for African Americans' goals for equal treatment. To the astonishment of many, including many in his own party, on July 26, 1948, Harry Truman made one of the biggest contributions to date for racial integration and equality. In issuing Executive Order 9981, Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces. These documents trace what some call the beginning of the civil rights movement. Great recovery, Mr. President, great recovery. If only George Wallace out of Alabama would have cleaned up his act. Check out that episode in our library. It is a gross recount of what this podcast believes is a terrible human being. We digress. After all of that, Truman decided not to run again and retired to Independence, Missouri. Most worshipful Truman was known as one of the most dedicated men to have joined Masonry. He was a member of a large number of orders even while serving as senator, vice president, and president. On February 9, 1909, he received his first degree after petitioning Belton Lodge No. 450 in Belton, Missouri. While his father was not a member, both of his grandfathers were. He also had various cousins, siblings, and nephews that were Masons. Truman was elected as the junior warden of his lodge in 1910 and became a key figure in organizing the lodge in Grandview, Missouri, becoming its first recorded master when it was formally chartered. He sat as master in 1917. In 1912, he entered the Scottish Rite Lodge of Perfection and Chapter Rose Croix in Kansas City. He completed the Scottish Rite degrees in 1917 before leaving for the war. Through the York Rite, he received the Chapter and Council degrees in Kansas City in 1919, and in 1923 was honored as a Knight Companion of the Red Cross of Constantine. From 1925 to 1930, he served as District Deputy Grand Master and Lecturer for the newly formed 59th Masonic District. He then proceeded to enter the Missouri Grand Lodge line, ultimately serving as Grand Master from 1940 to 1941. While his primary interest was the Blue Lodge, he also was honored in the Scottish Rite by being coronated as a 33-degree honorary in October of 1945 for both his service to Freemasonry and the United States. He also received the Gurgaz Medal by the Northern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. On May 18, 1959, Truman was presented with the 50 Years Award. He was the only U.S. president to reach that golden anniversary in Freemasonry. He became a member of the Aurora Shrine Temple in Kansas City in 1917. He served as the orator, the marshal, and the second ceremonial master for their divan. In 1931, he joined the invite-only Royal Order of Jesters, Kansas City Court No. 54. On December 26, 1972, Harry S. Truman passed away in Kansas City, Missouri due to complications from pneumonia at the age of 88. He is remembered for striving to live his life committed to our tenets of brotherly love, relief, and truth. We hope you enjoyed this episode by the old-fashioned Masonic podcast team. If you're not already a subscriber, please do so, and give us a like and a comment below. The views expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the old-fashioned Masonic podcast, any Grand Lodge or Shrine Center, and we encourage viewers to conduct their research and form their conclusions based on reliable sources and personal beliefs.